Right. Hi, everybody. I think I know most folks here, but for those I don't, my name is Caitlin. I've spent most of my career and time at the GSB across advanced energy technologies and carbon removal. And so today, I would like to speak to you about the carbon removal side and how we can think about industrial partnerships as a means to scale. So we'll go through a couple things in the next 8 minutes or so. I'd like to give you a bit of an overview around the project and why I chose this. Then I'd like to get into some of the findings around engagement principles and what partnerships actually look like in practice. So I'm an MBA E-IPER student, as mentioned. I've been working with Michael Bannon, who is on the infrastructure policy side of things on this, and he's been incredibly helpful, so thank you to him. So why carbon removal? Well, carbon removal is critical if we want to stay on a 2-degree path. Some estimates from the World Resources Institute indicate that we're going to need something like 10 billion tons a year by 2060, which is huge. But this technology is not really yet getting the support it needs to scale. Startups are developing technology, but as we look at the challenging path to scale, industrial partnerships are going to be critical. And so I wanted to spend some time really understanding how those partnerships are formed and what they can look like in practice. To do this, I relied on both interviews and desk research. So on the interview side, I spoke to 9 industrials, as well as experts and startups in the space, and then paired this with research on the actual partnerships that have been announced. So information that is in the public sphere, but is not easily accessible because it's across many different sources. All of this is coming together into a report that I plan to publish in late December. So let's get into the findings, and we'll start on engagement principles. Early partnerships are actually quite challenging for carbon removal startups, and they need to be navigated carefully. And that's because unlike other hard tech startups, like batteries, for example, carbon removal is often secondary for an industrial. It can either be an adjacent revenue stream or it's a risk mitigation measure, but it's quite rarely actually core to an industrial's business. And so navigating those partnerships takes work because it makes your value proposition more challenging and it makes finding the right champion harder. But across interviews, 5 core principles came up that can make that navigation easier. So the first, we'll start on corporate venture capital. So most large industrials have corporate VC teams, and these VC teams are really good at helping startups navigate within a company. They can help a startup to frame in a way that resonates with the industrial and their priorities. Notably, an investment from a CVC does not actually guarantee a pilot project. It is a good indicator. But conversely, many CVCs I spoke to were actually willing to help a startup navigate even if they didn't invest. So they're a great starting point. Then we move over to the business unit. This is the party you actually need on board if you want a partnership, because in most industrials, they hold the purse strings. This is where a startup's champion needs to be. But notably, a startup, when they are engaging, needs to understand that allocating funding to your pilot project means reducing funding for internal priorities. It's a fixed pool in most cases. And so a startup needs to be proposing their project in a way that is directly relevant to business unit priorities and is working on business unit metrics. Then we get to tech maturity. So tech maturity is relatively self-explanatory. Every company and indeed every business unit has got different limits on what type of technology risk they will take on. If you are not within the bounds of the tech risk they will take on, you are wasting your time. And so it's really important to be working with outside advisors, but also an internal champion early to navigate that. Final 2 here, say we've gotten to the point of actually defining a contract. This is when we have to make sure that there are boundaries in place to avoid what we call death by pilot. So ensuring that there is line of sight to the next phase of scale and that there's clarity around who makes decisions as this project evolves. And wrapping on that, adaptability is critical. Flexibility, patience, these things take time, a willingness to work within industrial budget cycles, and an understanding that not now does not mean no in an industrial context. In many cases, these are very long-term companies, and there's value to building long-term relationships. Let's take a step back and look at what this actually looks like in practice. So looking at around 30 recent partnerships, 6 archetypes start to emerge. And I think these are interesting because they can help us understand what type of partnership works best for a startup given their industry, their stage, their geography. Some of these are fairly self-explanatory, like offtake, but I'd like to focus on the two I find most interesting: cradle to scale and plug and play. So cradle to scale, this is a partnership that starts early, typically with an investment at seed or Series A stage from either the corporate VC or an affiliated incubator, like in the case of mining and oil and gas. There is agreement on R&D collaboration, there is a pilot project, and in most cases we looked at, there is a clear path to scale up and commercialization. But to justify this level of resources, the startup needs to be pretty closely aligned with the industrial's core business. For carbon removal startups, this can be tricky, as we talked about. And so in most cases, we see this with carbon removal. It's where there is a secondary value proposition. So they are either providing a input to the industrial's business, they are providing some sort of cost savings, or they're really addressing a material environmental risk. On the industrial side, this takes resources. And so an industrial who does this needs to have methods for resource allocation. This means having a centralized or coordinated innovation function and clear lines for decision making. It means having money available and R&D capacity. And so when you put this together, the industrials we typically see doing this are large and they have relatively high margins and deep pockets. This all sounds great for the startup, but there are two cautions. The first is that working very closely with a partner, single partner this early, can actually cause some IP concerns because your R&D is so entwined. The second, along the same lines, is it can start to limit market access as we think about later growth, because if you're working with one large industrial, their competitors may not want your technology in plant. And so as great as this is for a startup, they need to be managing those concerns from the get-go. Plug and play on the other end of the spectrum. This is a partnership focused on deployment, not on demonstration or tech development. The startup brings their technology, the industrial player brings the site, essentially. So startups who do this need to be relatively mature in their technology, ideally something that drops straight onto a site. It does not need to be core to the industrial's business. The industrial, on the other hand, just needs to be able to operate and set up a site. It's really not complicated. Most industrials can do this. We've seen to date most of the examples in water and in oil and gas. This makes it actually a really interesting model for certain carbon removal technologies because they aren't core to the business. We've seen it already with DAC, and I think there's a lot of promise with water-based carbon removal as we move forward. Key consideration here is around financing. So most industrials I spoke to said that they were not willing to take on both operational and financial risk because this is a low-risk model. And so a startup needs to bring external financing, which, as we heard from Ben, can be pretty challenging. I'll wrap at this point. If this is interesting, the report will be out in a couple weeks, and I would welcome any questions. Thank you.
Hello, great job. Super interesting to hear. I guess expanding upon what you've learned as you're exploring your 6 archetypes, which do you think have gained a lot more traction in terms of adoption by large industrial conglomerates, and which do you think should gain more traction?
Yeah, I'm going to actually run back to that slide because I think it's easiest to talk off that. So I think the 2 that I'm really seeing gain more traction, one is actually this cradle to scale. So a couple of years ago, there really aren't any examples, but as you start to look post-COVID, they become more frequent. And I think this is because we're seeing more and more focus on industry consortiums and industry cooperation. And it's way easier to do this if it's coming out of an incubator that is, you and your 3 competitors. It's not just you taking on the risk as the industrial. I also see a lot more coming on the offtake side. So particularly for stuff like e-fuels and the carbon technologies that feed into those. This seems to be a pretty popular model. Again, it's low risk, similar to the plug and play. So it's an attractive model for most industrials who don't necessarily want to commit or pick a technology yet. I do think what we need to see more of is the new venture piece, because there's a lot of these technologies that are not technologically mature enough to just be dropped onto a site, but have got huge potential beyond just carbon removal in, say, water filtration. And I think actually creates a lot of interesting new markets, but they aren't accessible for a startup because the infrastructure costs are just too high. And so this sort of JV model can protect IP, which was one of the big concerns on the fuller partnerships, but also bring that funding and enable project financing, because now you've got a credible, not lender, debtor.
This is awesome. Thank you. I feel like there's a lot of zeitgeist right now around companies backing away from ESG commitments, net zero commitments, especially those that are based outside of California. And my understanding is that a lot of companies' investment in carbon removal is like very tightly linked to net zero commitments.
Yep.
How do you think about the resiliency of carbon offtake specifically in corporate commitments?
Yeah. So it's a huge topic of discussion in the industry right now. I should caveat, I work for a carbon removal company, so they don't take IRA funding, and it is exactly for this reason, because there is a lot of concern that 45Q IRA is going to go away, and corporate targets look a little different if the market shifts. I think the conclusion that many people are coming to is that carbon removal companies are most likely to be resilient and successful when they do something that is not just selling carbon credits. So whether that is feeding the carbon stream into e-fuels, in the case of a couple of the different DAC companies, that's what they're proposing. We'll see if it works. Or purifying water streams. So a lot of the water-based carbon removal companies want to go onto a wastewater stream, and part of their value proposition is that it will be a much clearer stream coming out. So at desalination plants, at wastewater plants. That's actually where we see the new ventures models most commonly, where you have that sort of synergy because there's money in it for an industrial that is not tied to ESG demands. So I think we're going to see more and more of that in the companies that survive. There are hundreds of them right now. They cannot all make it, unfortunately. And I think the ones that do will be the ones with a secondary value proposition.
Excellent job. Thank you so much for this overview. I'm really interested in this report that's coming out. Can you tell us more? Where can we find it? How can we kind of elevate the learnings that you've showed us here?
Thank you for the easy question. It'll be coming out on LinkedIn. It has to go through a couple of the industrial partners just to confirm that we can share everything in public. But I will message you on LinkedIn. It will be on my profile. So please do share it.
Fantastic.